In case you're wondering about kind of what we're looking to cover tonight, I know at least the three of us on this stage. I know I speak for all of my colleagues at the Council. We're acutely aware of the intense and dire suffering of civilians on both sides of this conflict. Hamas's horrific and barbaric, almost ISIS-like attack on October 7th is killed 1,400 people, murdered 1,400 people, the largest loss of Jewish life in a short period of time since Hitler and the Nazis and the Holocaust. Conversely, while it is certainly understandable that the IDF and Netanyahu would desire a very strong response and a desire to eradicate or at least severely reduce the threat of Hamas, since Hamas is embedded within the Palestinian population and is very happy to use them, sadly, as human shields. At this stage, about 16,000 Palestinians have been killed. Even, I think on Monday, the IDF or some government officials for Israel acknowledged that of that 15,000, about 5,000 were probably Hamas fighters, but sadly that means about 10,000 were Palestinian civilians. And of that, we know obviously disproportionate numbers of those are women, are children, and the elderly. So I don't want to disregard what has happened in the war and the awful suffering on both sides, especially for civilians, whether they be Palestinians who might have been sympathetic to the idea of a Palestinian independent state, or Israelis who might have been sympathetic to a strong, understandably strong response to this vicious attack by Hamas. The civilian populations are the ones who are suffering the most right now. So we will talk a bit about the war and how we got here, but I really want to focus upon the regional implications, what those actors may or may not do. We have two very good experts right here, and really what may occur going forward. And then the bigger global implications. What does it mean for the US? What does it mean for European Union? What does it mean for Russia and for China? So if you will bear with us, we're going to try and cover a lot in a relatively short period of time. And if it seems like we're skipping over anything, it's just we're trying to give you a very broad overview of all the implications of what's happening. Rick, maybe I'll just start with you. You have a fascinating career in the State Department. You were Deputy Director for Intelligence and Research in the State Department leading up to and during the Oslo Accords. So you saw the highest and the best intelligence the United States had. You also worked in the Sinai. You learned Hebrew. A lot of deep experience with regards to Israel and Palestinian issues and the neighboring countries. One thing that is sadly true for both the Israelis and the Palestinians, if they have anything in common, is they have severe lack of or challenges to effective leadership. We will get to the issues of the Palestinians, but maybe just to open, before this war even took place, can you talk about the struggles for the Israeli people with regards to Netanyahu increasingly becoming authoritarian or autocratic for some people's perspective, the biggest public demonstrations, some of the biggest demonstrations in decades, with people across the board from the left, the right, the military, academics. Can you talk about the state of Israeli leadership leading up to the war?
Well, I think when it comes to Netanyahu, I believe that he, well, first of all, let me say that as we go through this evening, as my son said when I was talking to him about this presentation and bouncing ideas off of him, he said, it looks like you're going to provide equal opportunity, frustration, and aggravation to everybody in the audience by saying something that may not sit well with some of you, better with others. The next thing I say, we'll switch that around. When it comes to Israel, I think, and when you talk about the going forward, I think the going forward here is crucial. And going forward, whatever is developed as some sort of resolution of what's happening now, we have to realize we're dealing with an Israel that is not the Israel of Ben Gurion, Golda Meir, Moshe Dayan, Abba Eban. It is a proto-authoritarian state run by somebody who behaves more like a Polish or Hungarian leader, and whose main goal, is actually to stay in power, because he must stay in power or he faces more charges, and some of those may or may not be all that truthful, and they may or may not be political, actually, but he sees that as the only way he can avoid more criminal charges, basically, is what it amounts to, facing those charges. Another thing I think we have to realize about Israel, this is odd, is because of its structure of having so many political parties, it was in my era the parties that held the most sway in Israel were the religious parties, who still hold a lot of sway. However, what has happened since my time of living in Israel is Israel has had a massive immigration as the homeland of the Jews from Russia. And most of the Russians who move in bring with them a Russian culture. They may be Jewish, but they bring that basic empire building kind of dark belief that comes with being Russian. I hope I'm insulting somebody who's Russian. You're Russians. There's a reason for the Dostoevskys of the world. And they have almost uniformly almost become Putin-like in the way that they want the state to operate, and they want the state to operate to include the West Bank. Land for peace used to be the deal, but the current population in Israel, again with that swing vote, we see it in our own Congress where extremes kind of affect what happens for the majority. The extremes of many of those Russian parties, and there's more than one of these parties that's heavily influenced by the Russians, is leading them to think it used to be land for peace. Israel would give back the 67 land, and the Palestinians and the Arabs would give peace. The newer Israel wants the land and peace. And they really buy into, you don't see it written, but the subculture in Israel is the Ariel Sharon position that Palestine used to be from the ocean to the hills of Jordan. Ariel Sharon was famous for saying that the Palestinians do have a Palestinian state. It's called Jordan, where they are a majority. And I think increasingly that has become the sub-rosa politics in Israel. We mean to keep the West Bank, and we will take what it means in the way of suffering in the meantime to make that happen, because we'll wait out everybody else over whether it's 1 year, 10 years, another 20 years.
And I'll turn in a moment to Hamas and Palestinian leadership or dearth of leadership. But just in terms of Netanyahu's overall view of the scenario, and I suppose a lot of people think he has never been a true proponent of a two-state solution. You may have read, or people may have seen recently, a few weeks ago in Haaretz, one of the major Israeli newspapers released internal dialogue from Netanyahu's meeting with his own party, Likud leaders. And I just want to say verbatim what it is. And his words are, and the idea is that Netanyahu favors dysfunctional and divided Palestinian leadership because that means they can never effectively be one voice. So he favors pitting the West Bank and Fatah against Gaza and Hamas. Just tell me what you've heard of this and if you believe it's accurate. Supposedly Netanyahu's words were, when he was regarding allowing Qatar to transfer up to $1 billion over 6 years to Hamas, or to Gaza, much of it to Hamas. The quote is for Netanyahu: "The money transfer is part of the strategy to divide the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Anyone who opposes the establishment of a Palestinian state needs to support the transfer of money from Qatar to Hamas. In that way, we will foil the establishment of a Palestinian state." Do you think that's probably a legitimate quote?
I think it's a legitimate quote. It's supposedly directly from the meeting. There have been a number of reports along those same lines that basically, and it would fit with what I would take to be Netanyahu's political personality, where he often will seek to divide people in order to basically stay king of the mountain. You try to divide those who might otherwise threaten you. And I think that Netanyahu believed the official Palestinian leadership, the Palestinian Authority, fronted by Mahmoud Abbas, was feckless and useless, which most Palestinians would agree with me, it's feckless and useless. The real power he saw and the threat to Israel was Hamas. So if he could keep those dividing and rather than dividing and conquering, dividing and keeping conquered was kind of his strategy. And I think that's true, that he probably was actually playing a political game. The result of that, unfortunately, and more astute analysts than I have written about this, the unfortunate result of that was the Palestinians became frustrated that they simply weren't getting anywhere, and with the Abraham Accords and other things, they were losing ground and losing ground and losing ground. And the more the Palestinians feel marginalized, the more likely they are to turn to atrocities and terrorism. The rise of the PLO in the late 60s and 70s in Munich was specifically related to the fact that the Arab world and the Western world really were not delivering on the hope for land for peace after 67, and that empowered Arafat to build his terrorist network. They got the attention they wanted. They got somewhat of a half-peace deal in the 90s, but then it began to fall apart again. So once again, they still don't have a homeland. They still don't have a place to call their own. And for that reason, Hamas, in whatever were their internal councils that we don't know the results of, they finally decided this was the time to strike in a particularly atrocious way, which unfortunately, from a Palestinian view, unfortunately did harm to their cause in many ways. It just made them once again look like horrific ISIS persons rather than people needing a homeland.
And Christian, turning to Palestinian leadership and really the dire circumstance the average Palestinians find themselves in. Fatah, the dominant political force in the West Bank, incredibly corrupt, incredibly inefficient. Rick mentioned 87-year-old Mahmoud Abbas, the effective leader, whose term should have ended in 2009, but they haven't had a legitimate election in about 15 years. Hamas, even worse, extreme terrorist organization, but basically in power for about 17 years now. No elections either in Gaza. Could you maybe just talk about the other unfortunate reality of the Palestinian situation is that whether it be from 1948 or 1967, 1963, millions of Palestinians have ended up as refugees in Lebanon, in Jordan, and in Egypt and elsewhere. They haven't been taken in by wealthy countries like the Saudis or the Emiratis or the Qataris. While Israel was a convenient boogeyman for a lot of these absolute monarchs and dictators to say, don't look at what we're doing, look how bad the Israelis are treating the Palestinians. The reality of the matter is, and even more so recently, Hamas and the Palestinian situation has not been anywhere near a priority for most of the states in the region. Can you talk about how the Saudis, the Gulf states, and the big players have viewed Palestinians and a new relationship with Israel in the last few years?
Yes, absolutely. And as you say, the Gulf states have never been frontline states. They've never been part of the confrontation with Israel in 48, 67, 73. Quite the opposite. I mean, they were supporting with financial and in 73 with the oil weapon as well, but they were never part of the conflict themselves. And beginning in the 1990s, you began to see quite a shift, not uniform throughout the Gulf. Kuwait remained opposed to any form of relationship with Israel. But Israel opened trade offices in Qatar and Oman in the 1990s. In 1994, Yitzhak Rabin became the first Israeli prime minister to go to the Gulf when he went to Oman. We saw with the Oslo Accords, the Gulf states beginning to engage very cautiously with Israel in some of the post-Oslo regional processes, meetings for the very first time. We saw an end of the secondary boycott. And so you did see an increasing normalization without having full political and economic and diplomatic ties. For the Gulf states as well, the fact that in 1990 the Arafat supported Saddam Hussein when Iraq invaded Kuwait, that led to huge repercussions for the Palestinian cause in the Gulf. Once Kuwait was liberated in 91, you had tens of thousands of Palestinians being evicted from Kuwait and from other Gulf states, and relations took decades to fully repair. What I think this October 7th, which is now 2 months ago tomorrow, has really changed was the notion in the Gulf that you could somehow separate the Palestinian issue from integrating political and diplomatic relations with Israel, which was the beginning, the heart of the Abraham Accords in 2020, that sort of flipping on the head the notion that land for peace, as Rick said, the notion that you would have a deal first and then normalization. Instead, you saw normalization happen with Bahrain and the UAE, and then we may begin to think about what happens next with the Palestinians.
And just to follow up on that, Christian, obviously it's hard to really know the inner workings of Hamas, but a lot of people speculate that if it's not specific occurrences over the last few weeks and months, proposed announcements with the Saudis, but compared to 5 years ago or 10 years ago, the degree of closeness between Israel and some of the Gulf states, we think of the Abraham Accords, not just Gulf states, but Morocco and Sudan, and probably most importantly with regards to increasing closeness with the Saudis because of Israel and all those Arab states' dire concern about the bigger threat of Iran, that maybe Hamas felt we have to do something to kind of throw a dagger into any further developments between Israel and our Arab nations. Do you think that's accurate?
Well, it seems that Hamas had been planning this attack for some time. Now, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, did say on September 20th, so just 2.5 weeks before, that every day we get closer to a Saudi-Israel peace deal, which he said would be the biggest deal since the end of the Cold War. So he was very much preparing public opinion in Saudi for a breakthrough. I think that momentum has been stopped, at least for now. The Saudis have said the talks have been paused. However, no Arab state has pulled out yet from the Abraham Accords. UAE and Bahrain, Morocco, potentially Sudan, we're not quite sure whether they did normalize or not. But no state has yet withdrawn. So I think all the Arab leaders that did see a relationship with Israel as being in their regional interest continue to do so, given that they share some of the same geopolitical interests vis-a-vis Iran and Islamism, Islamist groups. Now, those are unchanged. What I think was interesting, though, was that 4 days or 5 days after October the 7th, Mohammed bin Salman spoke with the Iranian president for the first time. And that was interesting because I think it showed that from a Saudi point of view, the last thing they want now is any regional conflict when Mohammed bin Salman needs to focus absolutely on delivering his Vision 2030 and all of his major projects, which cannot be, well, they rely on huge numbers of people going to live, work, and do business in Saudi Arabia. And so if you're in the middle of a war zone, all that will be put at risk. And NEOM, of course, which is the most famous of these projects on the Red Sea, NEOM is basically a few miles away from Israel. You have NEOM, Aqaba, and Eilat, and then the Sinai. So all of his plans are predicated on stability and security, and this conflict puts that at risk.
And the last bit on kind of the big Arab players in the region. In some ways, in terms of making decisions, the fact that they're either absolute monarchies or they're autocratic states like Egypt, do you think that'll make it easier for MBS or MBZ or Sisi to push through what they ultimately want, even if their own populace wants a better scenario or kind of results for the Palestinian people?
It's probably a lot easier for Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, just because their populations are a lot less politically and economically precarious than, say, the Egyptian population. And for Sisi, I think any potential deal that he would do to accept Palestinians fleeing Gaza, moving into Egypt, I think would be so politically difficult for Egyptians to take that it could risk setting another kind of Egyptian uprising aflame. So I think for the Gulf, it's probably a lot more isolated, more containable than, say, for Egypt.
And Rick, turning to the other very serious concern, Hamas was an extreme danger for Israel for a long time, but the force that's 3, 4, 5 times bigger in terms of number of fighters, in terms of military weapons, in terms of direct capabilities, in terms of controlling areas, is Hezbollah. Are you surprised so far that the relative degree of action and kind of skirmishes that Hezbollah has considered has not escalated? And beyond just Hezbollah, how much authority do you think Iran actually has with regards to the actions of Hezbollah, Hamas, and they even say the Houthis down in Yemen, who are even launching missiles at convoys that are protected by American warships?
Not long after October 7th, there was a meeting between the Iranians who flew to Lebanon and met with Hezbollah leaders. And some people, including me at the time, thought that this was maybe a war meeting where they were going to plan on how they were going to jump in with Hamas. I think as events have transpired since then, it's pretty clear that the Iranians don't want a regional conflict either, that they want to. I wrote an article for 1945 where I talked about the war of 1,000 bees. They have neither the interest, willpower, or military power to really create a conflict in the region. Instead, they want to diminish it and picket Israel in small ways. After that meeting, Hezbollah continued rocketing and various attacks along the northern Lebanese border, but within very constrained parameters, typically hitting mostly military bases or military encampments, using lesser rockets, not some of their heavy-duty rockets. They stayed away from long-distance rockets. Iran has decided to, in a slightly more direct way, deal with its frustration by rocketing U.S. troops through the militias operating in Iraq and not joining in directly. The Iranians and the Saudis had a telephone conversation that was talked about in the Tehran Times about 4 or 5 days ago, in which they talked about military issues and cooperation. So I think my feeling is increasingly everybody among those outside players, Hezbollah included, have other irons in the fire that aren't related to coming in any sort of heavy way in support of Hamas. Hezbollah's main goal is to become the theocratic state of Lebanon. And they're building toward that, and they've been building toward that over a long time. 2006 taught them that if they take the Israelis on big time, Lebanon gets the same sort of approach in response as Gaza is getting now. And in 2006, they fell back politically in Lebanon and were heavily criticized and lost a lot of political credibility. I don't think they want to do that again because they're focused on that longer goal, controlling Lebanon. Iran has too much domestic influence, does not want to upset the oil. If they get too involved in stuff, they would be afraid the Persian Gulf might become difficult to ship oil out of, whether there are sanctions or not. They're bringing in significant revenue on the black market, so they're doing better at that, and they really want to focus on economics, which is exactly what the Saudis, and that's why they're talking to the Saudis. The one wild card in this, and they've been a wild card to everybody, including the Iranians, are the Houthis. And I would look for the Houthis to continue from kind of their mystical version of things to probably continue some attacks on the Red Sea. That's one way that they can get into the game. They don't have enough firepower, and they would not want to completely upset their Iranian supporters So they probably won't do much more than they've already done, a missile here, a missile there, a ship here, a ship there. But that may be the most active region where the Iranians don't have much control.
And Christian, just turning back to the Gulf, the ever influential country, despite its small size, but it's just overflowing with money. The Qataris never seek to surprise people. They're obviously, for many years, been willing to play both sides of the fence, have good relationships, probably the best relationships with Iran as compared to most of the Gulf states. They have long had strong relations, for instance, with the Taliban. And for better or worse, they were a conduit for the United States to negotiate with the Taliban. Hostages taken all across the region by different terrorist groups, whether it be Hamas or Islamic Jihad or whatever awful terrorist group you think of. They were there, but in some ways, it's useful to have somebody who's willing to work with and talk with all sides. Can you talk about the Qatari role recently and what you think it might be going forward?
Yes, so the Qataris have been quite frustrated, I think, with a lot of the criticism they've been receiving over the last 2 months by people asking why Hamas political leadership has been based in Doha, in Qatar. And they would make the point that both with Hamas and the Taliban, the opening of offices in Doha around 2011, 2012 was precisely because US officials wanted to know where to reach representatives of that movement, if and where necessary. And with the Taliban, it became a venue for hostage negotiations in 2014, and eventually for on-off dialogue, which then produced the direct US-Taliban negotiations before the agreement in 2020 for withdrawal from Afghanistan. With Hamas, you had intense negotiation in 2014, another round of fighting in Gaza lasted 50 days. Qatar began to provide, as you said, financial and humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza with full Israeli coordination. From an Israeli point of view, I think, to prevent a complete implosion of humanitarian conditions in Gaza. And to the extent that Israeli officials would fly to Qatar every 6 months to request that this continue, most recently this last summer. So I think there's a degree of sensitivity that this is now being turned against them. I think what has changed, obviously the sheer horror of what has happened on October the 7th, means that there probably can be no going back to that status quo ante, that something will have to give with the political leadership in Doha. But it's probably better to have them in Qatar than, say, in Iran or in Syria. I mean, they moved to Qatar from Damascus when they fell out with the Assad regime after 2011. So it's probably better to have them where they can at least be surveilled, controlled to some extent, albeit that what we saw on October 7th indicates that the political group in Qatar probably doesn't call the shots over what Hamas does back at home, in the same way that became apparent after the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan, when it became very obvious that the Taliban representatives in Qatar had been completely outmaneuvered by much more hardline factions. And again, once they were back in power, they were just shunted aside.
And I'll first turn to you, Christian, and then Rick. Other parts of the world, both of you are excellent Middle East experts. I know you're not experts on Russia or China or the European Union. And you can give your perspectives on American politics as well, which we'll get to. But Christian, maybe I would just start with Russia. You all might have noticed the headlines today that Vladimir Putin, since the full-scale invasion last year, has been in, I think, 3 places outside of Russia. I think Iran, China, and occupied portions of Ukraine. Today, I think he landed in UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and he is going to go to Saudi Arabia. And I think when he gets back to Moscow, he's hosting Iranian President Raisi. Can you talk about, is this just blind good luck for Putin? He obviously loves to see the Ukraine war taken out of the headlines, and himself and President Xi and China love the idea of broadcasting to the developing world that Israel, the United States, they don't care about the developing world. They're the new colonizers, despite the fact the Russian Empire, Soviet Union are the largest land empires in recent modern history. Can you talk about what do you think Putin and the Russians are getting out of this? And maybe either of you comment on it, and maybe the Chinese, who obviously been stepped back and kind of more quiet.
Well, Putin was in Abu Dhabi this morning, met with Mohammed bin Zayed, was given a fly past by UAE fighter jets, displaying the Russian flag with their smoke. So a huge, very visible display of welcome. He then went to Saudi Arabia, met with Mohammed bin Salman, was talking about energy and Gaza. Clearly a highly symbolic visit to demonstrate that he's welcome in two of the closest US partners in the Middle East. I mean, the Saudi Arabia, the UAE are still very close US partners. And for Putin to show that he is welcome there is, I think, sending a message as much to Washington as to anyone else. Breaking out of his post-2022 isolation. Obviously, the UAE has become a haven for Russian capital, Russian investors and business people fleeing sanctions elsewhere. And even before October 7th, we'd seen Middle Eastern countries refusing to take sides in Ukraine or in the kind of great power competition between the US and China. They were effectively saying, this is not our battle. You know, we're keeping out of it. And what we see now is, especially in the Middle East, the sense of perception of double standards, especially with Israel and Ukraine, has really shattered any consensus on Ukraine. And that is absolutely to Putin's advantage. And of course, he only has to wait another 11 months until he may get a new occupant in the White House, which of course he's probably waiting for.
And Rick, again, I know you're not a China expert, and Christian, if you want to touch upon it as well. The Chinese degree of influence and investment and billions and billions of dollars spread across much of the Middle East over the last good number of years is impressive. But can you talk about maybe how you see this kind of impacting the overall kind of growing or emerging, or not emerging, but emerged kind of new rivalry again between the United States and China, this version of kind of a new Cold War?
Oh, okay. Before that, I'd like to add a comment on Russia. It was, to me, logical that Putin went first to the UAE, because to the extent that Russia is able to continue to sell its oil, continue to engage in the international market, economically trade in all sorts of products, both imports and exports, banking facility for that's largely denied them, and that has been replaced by the gray banking and finance system in several areas of the world. But the UAE, to me, and I'll defer to Christian on that, is basically the leader in gray financing of Russian stuff. So he was there to say thank you a little bit. Okay. And I will agree with Christian too, to the extent he's visiting UAE and Saudi Arabia. I suspect that whatever Putin thinks he's getting out of it, those two Arab countries are going to look and say, you know, listen, United States, if you want us on your team, we may need some of your planes, your missiles, your whatever, or we're going to get them from the Russians just like the Turks did. Mm-hmm. So on the China front, China, I think, is mainly interested. No matter what it does, it seems to be driven by the economic and the trade aspects of things. And I don't see, other than competing for oil, which China needs desperately, and we don't need as much of that, so they want to cement their oil supplies, and the general structure of trade. I'm not sure the Chinese are, let me put it this way, it was very odd to see anybody from China in my days in the Middle East at all. I think they're way behind in much influence other than through Belt and Road Initiative. And the most recent thing with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is continuing to unravel a little bit with under Xi, is Italy pulled out. Mm-hmm. And Africa's not too happy with the debts they're acquiring because they come with big projects. And Xi's not giving all the money that he supposedly was originally to Belt and Road, for Italy, for instance, and I think elsewhere. So I don't see too much, and if there are audience questions or Christian would disagree, I don't see the Chinese being able to leverage much out of this particular series of events in the Middle East to advance any of their main interest in the area.
And I just want to, one or two more questions. I want to turn to audience questions. My colleagues passing out those question cards. I have no rose-colored glasses. Sadly, I think we're many months and maybe much longer from any real kind of long-term cessation in combat in terms of ongoing hostilities. But to try and maybe have a bit of a positive thought going forward, this might seem idealistic, but you think 1973 war, incredible shock to the Israelis, somehow seen as intelligence failure. A lot of blame initially on the intelligence, the military at first, but obviously turned around very well, had a very decisive victory. You mentioned the Arab oil embargo that came not too long after that. It was a different time back then. Most of those Arab states were definitively against Israel. The Arab states now, especially behind closed doors, have very relatively good and increasing relations with Israel. The Arab oil embargo in the 70s and the kind of collective global pain is part of what led to eventually Camp David Accords. It took a few years, but do either of you see the absolute dire and horrific suffering and death, and thousands of civilians have been killed on both sides, and the intensity of this conflict perhaps leading to some form of effective and real-term solution to the Palestinian issue? I don't know if Christian, you want to start?
Take the lead.
Easy question.
I mean, as you say, there were times of great rupture in 73 and then also in 1990 with the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, which led to the Madrid conference in 1991. And then eventually, ironically, by a non-US involved secret channel to the Oslo Accords, at least at the beginning. So, I mean, those moments of great strain did at least maybe galvanize players to think about taking a new approach, just because the status quo you can't go back to. And so I think if one wants to try to be positive, it's whenever this conflict does come to an end, all parties will at least realize that they simply cannot go back to what was there before. And as you said, there haven't been elections in the West Bank since 2009, in Gaza since 2006. Obviously, Israel has its own political and electoral issues too. So if there's a way to break that logjam on all three parts, then, I mean, you just need fresh leadership for a start. You need fresh leadership. 87 years old Mahmoud Abbas. It's clear that Hamas will not have a role going forward in Gaza. So something just needs to emerge and to be given the space to emerge. So maybe that would be the kind of optimistic view.
We need every bit of optimism we can get right now. So, Rick, you have anything else?
Well, I'm going to start with a negative and build toward a potential positive. The negative is this: if you asked me to bet $100 on something that would be a pretty sure bet to win, I wouldn't bet on the Texans in their next game. But I probably would bet that $100 on there being yet another version of this type of flare-up in the Middle East, probably in 2028, which is the 80th anniversary of the Nakba to the Palestinians. If you really begin to think about this, we've had 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, 1982 invasion of Lebanon, 1987 Intifada, Persian Gulf War. Now we have the second Intifada in 2000. 2006, they take on Hezbollah. And now, once again, we have the Gaza atrocities. And as Christian says, something has to emerge to change that, or else 2028 or some other flare point will cause the next one of these violent conflicts. What I would suggest emerging, if there is to be something emerging, is oddly enough to play off of the fact that the Palestinians, in terms of any ability to govern or stand up enough to even represent the Palestinian people, that just does not exist in the Palestinian movement. it is probable in the next 3 or 4 or 5 years that the leading power within the Palestinian movement will shift from Fatah to Hamas. On the West Bank, more and more the West Bankers are buying into Hamas. Hamas is going to be the new Palestinian movement. Well, we can't deal in dialogue with somebody who wants to push Israel into the sea, so that's a non-starter. What it's probably going to take is for a coalition of like-minded governments, some governments from the Middle East that straddle both borders, whether it's Qatar or Morocco, Egypt, along with some Western powers, to put together a coalition to basically, we keep talking about what after Israel does sweep through Gaza, what next? What's the after effect? I think that's when an international coalition could come in and act as a trusteeship. This is not my idea. I'm not very brilliant. This is an idea that the former ambassador to Israel, Martin Indyk, wrote about all the way back in the early 2000s, that because the Palestinians do not have enough ability to govern themselves in the sense that they can put together a meaningful, credible group to govern, you replace them for trusteeship for a set period of time, possibly 10 or 20 years, but let them build their governance within the system. And if we put in some sort of international coalition, which now you're dealing with a ton of Israeli red flags, so we just don't know how that would work. But if we could somehow get the Israelis to agree, we could at least dampen down the conflict, even if we might not build a Palestinian state.
A good question for the audience. A lot of people have a similar question. Eric asked, and if either of you or both of you want to answer, give your own position, has this played out according to Hamas's playbook and expectations when they launched the attack on October 7th? Just to relate to that, they knew and absolutely planned for a massive retaliation by the IDF, by the Israelis, knowing it would lead to the deaths of hundreds or probably thousands of Palestinians. But do you think, in essence, this is what they wanted? This is what they expected? And either Christian, you want to go first?
Hamas, I think, has always tried to show that they're the ones who are going to take the fight to Israel. And so in that sense, they are demonstrating that, and they did so in the most horrific and unprecedented terms on October the 7th, perhaps even surprising themselves by the scale of what they were able to do. And they would have known that this retaliation would come. Now, if they're thinking long term, they're probably thinking, as Rick has said, that this will just solidify their standing, not only among Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, but also among that entire kind of axis of resistance, where it's now Hamas, which is the one resisting Israel in the same way it was Hezbollah in 2006. So if and when, and of course Israel is now subject to intense international scrutiny and criticism. So if the objective has been to also weaken the international consensus on Israel, then to some extent Hamas has gotten part of that over the last 2 months. Mm-hmm. Question, of course, is what's left of Gaza once this is over. And I think that, again, probably shows that Hamas's first priority is not the civilian population over whom they rule.
Rick, anything to
Yeah,
add?
I think as our own generals say, once the attack begins, all the playbooks and planning goes out the window, and now you deal with the aftermath, which is never exactly what you planned for. We actually see that, oddly enough. I'll refer to Ukraine. Ukraine's counteroffensive, well planned, everything else they attacked didn't work out. For Hamas, I think it depends upon whether you're looking short term, medium term, long term. I think Hamas accomplished what it wanted to accomplish in its first attack, much more atrociously than people should try. They should have focused just on military bases, but that's another story. They've harmed their credibility tremendously and underscored their terrorism by what they did, but they accomplished what they wanted to elevate the Palestinian cause once again and strike at that enemy, Israel, which they want to push into the sea, so they accomplished that. They took the hostages, I think, partly figuring the hostages would protect them from the retaliation. But unfortunately, Netanyahu has pretty much, nobody's going to say it publicly, but the hostages he's going to take over Gaza. And if that means a lot of hostages are killed, that's going to happen. They're collateral damage in Netanyahu's authoritarian thinking. In the longer term for Hamas, I don't think Hamas either really cares about the civilians. They actually only had minority support among Palestinians, and what limited polling could be done in Gaza. They would have preferred somebody other than Hamas, but Hamas had Gaza by the throat, so they had to suffer. I don't think they care much about the civilians. What they do care about, I think, is to empower themselves, as we've discussed, but also they're playing into the notion we will elevate the cause. That's number one. Number two, we will also, the more that we can get the Israelis to do bombing in which we can pull women and children out of the rubble, what Tom Friedman of the New York Times wrote about 20, 30 years ago, whenever you attack terrorism, when you kill one terrorist, you build 10 more. For every child being pulled out of the rubble in Gaza, he probably has 6 or 8 kids similar in his family, or nieces or nephews, who, whatever they thought about Israel before, and especially if they're put in diaspora and pushed into Egypt, they will become the new Palestinian terrorist group, and Hamas will probably become more potent in terms of terrorism, even if it loses its base. So Israel tactically wins the battle for Gaza, but strategically loses the war about whether or not they're going to be attacked again by Hamas. They will be attacked again by Hamas.
Maybe either of y'all or both of you want to answer just relatively briefly, just to try and finish the audience questions. I know we just have a few more minutes. 2 related questions. Someone asked, is Israel's systematic destruction of Gaza strategically valuable to Israel? And related to that is, will Israel's world position suffer significantly because of the Gaza invasion and the response? Christian, you want to start?
Well, I mean, flattening Gaza, or at least destroying civilian infrastructure, I think doesn't, I mean, unless the goal is to effectively displace the Palestinians from Gaza, which would be such an order of magnitude, I think, additional criticism to Israel from the regional and international community. And if, assuming that's not the objective, destroying what remains of the civilian infrastructure just makes it more difficult to imagine that any post-conflict reconstruction could take place in a context that allows for at least some possibility that you don't have an embittered, radicalized, furious, impoverished population that will continue to form a huge threat to Israel's stability and security. And doing, I think, what we've been seeing over the past few weeks for another few months, I think would risk, well, I mean, I think it probably already has, but it would risk really passing a point of no return in terms of what would be left for the people in Gaza, who already, I think we're seeing 80% displacement within the Gaza Strip, 1.8 million people displaced. Where are they going to go? And so I think the longer this goes on, the more damaging it gets in terms of civilian damage to Israel's standing internationally, but also in terms of any potential reconciliation with Palestinians further down the line.
I think in the short term there might be some damage to Israel's reputation, but we have to remember the baseline we're working with. In the UN General Assembly, as opposed to the Security Council, if there's a resolution put forth that's critical of Israel, you get maybe 40 or 50 abstentions out of the 194 some members, and you only get 2 votes against that resolution saying something critical about Israel. Most of the General Assembly is going to vote for something to criticize Israel, and we'll see tomorrow when we do the 99, the Article 99 exercise. but two vote with Israel, us and the island nation of Palau. And that's because 70% of Palau's federal budget comes from our Interior Department, which is dating back to colonial times. So I think Israel's reputation in the general world is not really great anyway. And those that count, us and also those who abstain, such as France, Britain, Italy, etc., they're not going to dramatically change their view of Israel because of this particular situation.
And I just want to close with these two questions. I know it's hard, but if you both can just try and try to be brief. Someone asked a good question. We were all wondering how will the U.S. election year be impacted with regards to this, with regards to Biden and Trump and their foreign policy, and how do you see this playing out, both of you, in terms of next year's American election? You want to start, Christian? I know neither of you are American political experts, but sure.
You want me to take the lead so poor Christian can have some time to think about it? Because I've thought about it, and in fact, I wrote about it in one of my articles. I think in terms of the real harm to Israel isn't its reputation internationally or its economic commercial business. I think over time that will, with a decent interval, will recover and get back to normal. The problem I see for Israel is that what we are, well, let me put it this way. We have a president who is a 20th century Cold Warrior. And I often teach my classes at the University of St. Thomas. Sophia, where are you? For leadership, you need three things: the attributes of the leader themselves, followers who will follow you, and a good understanding of the context. Mm-hmm. And I think Biden is missing the context here of what's going on in Gaza by the unusually heavy bombing, which really militarily doesn't equate with what we were able to do in Fallujah and other places with more precise infantry-type engagements. It could have been done differently. The visuals of that are playing out domestically, and again, I am not the expert, but there have been several articles now written and several studies done. In 2020, 59% of Arab American voters voted for Biden. Only 15% in the latest poll will vote for Biden. And you begin to calculate by how much Biden won in Georgia, Florida, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona. Michigan. He now loses those states.
Michigan, a big
very big population in Michigan. And he may lose the presidency, not necessarily because there's a terrible vote against him where the Arab Americans turn out and vote against him, because they don't like Trump either, the Islamophobe, okay? But they just don't show up. And when you won Michigan by 30,000 and you have 300,000 Arab American voters, if 100,000 of those voters choose not to show up because they can't vote for either side, suddenly the Republicans win Michigan. And I know I'm running on here. The House could be lost because California is a lock blue state, but there's big Arab American populations in the southern part of and more contested districts in Southern California. 4 or 5 seats in the House in California can swing on the Arab American vote, either voting against the Democratic candidate because of what happened or not voting at all, and we could lose, the Democrats, if they want to win, could lose the House. I think Trump is missing it, and that's going to be where Israel ultimately loses, because 2024 is going to say how much political support does Israel retain here in the United States, as Israel retains a lot. For what it's doing now, not so much.
Christian, I know, again, I don't want to put you on the spot. I know you're not a political expert on American politics, which would be pretty depressing right now anyway. But Eddie, anything you'd like to add? Or?
I mean, it's often said that elections are won on domestic policy, not foreign policy, which makes it all the more frustrating if you're Biden, because all of his legislative successes have not translated into political support. But when you see these calamities unfolding on the TV screens night after night, that does have a visible image that really shapes perceptions. And for Biden, we saw first with Afghanistan, the fall of Kabul. Biden began August 2021 10 points ahead in the approval polls, ended August 2021 10 points behind. It was that flip, and his ratings have never recovered. And we see already now, I think there's a poll that showed that his support among Democrats has slipped by 11 points in October. And that already, I think in March this year, more Democrats under the age of 35 kind of were sympathetic towards the Palestinians than towards Israel. So there's kind of generational changes too. And this is part of what Rick was saying, this kind of coalition of support that he can't afford to really lose in any real part of the electoral map. If he's going to lose support among younger Democrats, among progressives, among Arab Americans, potentially other groups too, then it's going to be really difficult for him to win.
And lastly, I know it's difficult to project, but Linda asks, can you discuss who might be able to negotiate the future of the Palestinians? Both Hamas and Abbas are absolutely discredited. And in parallel to that, a lot of people say Netanyahu, because the threat of the war, the dire circumstances, has a temporary coalition that even those who are not supportive of him are willing to work with. But do you agree with the premise that he too probably will not survive the next 6 months or year when everything's settled down enough for Israeli politics to kind of get back to normal? Who do either of you see as potential leaders for the Israelis a year or 2 or 3 from now, and the Palestinians? Because in a lot of ways we probably need new leadership in all regards to have any chance of a solution. Rick, you want to start?
Well, on the Palestinian side, I will say this: the Palestinians won't have a leader. That's where that coalition comes in. Basically, that coalition's got to say, we're going to put a trusteeship in place. We will negotiate the Palestinian cause. Are they left on the side? Yeah, but they don't have anybody. You can use Mahmoud Abbas as a figurehead, perhaps. A lot of Palestinians talk about Marwan Barghouti, who has been in jail for murder, multiple murders, supposedly. Partly, he was involved in Tanzim, which is a fairly heavy-duty Fatah group operating in the West Bank, and probably deserves to be in jail for terrorist acts, to be honest. But there's been a lot of talk about releasing him to become the new leader. Rabin finally met with and dealt with Arafat, as did subsequent Israeli leaders, despite his terrorist activities. So that would be one person. Beyond that, I was actually, for other reasons, researching who might else be there, and there's really not anybody there. The most known Palestinian leaders are all on the Hamas sides, and obviously can't speak up for the Palestinians, would not be accepted as Palestinian interlocutors. On the Israeli side, that is very hard to figure out. Netanyahu's polling numbers are such that his party would not have the majority. Yesh Atid might, that's more moderate secular party might. Who might ultimately be the leader, though, would depend upon how the cards fell in the actual election, how many seats were made, and who joined the coalition. So it's really hard to say. There's no, on the Israeli side either, there's no real outstanding name.
And Christian, obviously Rick covered a lot of the points that are out there, but is there anything you'd add to in regards to where you see the future of Palestinian or Israeli leadership, and maybe any last closing comments you'd like to give?
Well, I also have heard lots of chatter about Barghouti, and I mean, the fact that he has been in prison for the last 20 years or so means he's been sidelined from, obviously, the Hamas and the Fatah sort of decline. I mean, I know there are people in the Palestinian kind of communities who think he could be the sort of almost like a Nelson Mandela figure who comes out of prison after decades. That's probably quite a stretch, a bit of a fanciful analogy, but at least he's been removed from this political landscape that has been so discredited. So if he is, maybe if he's the only choice, it's probably a tough bullet to bite, but we'll see.
And would you add anything with regards to Israeli possible leaders down the line, or too hard to project at this point?
I think we forget that. The October 7th came after 6 months of massive protests in Israel against Netanyahu and his government. And he was deeply unpopular, and Israel was deeply divided even before the 7th of October. And so if we see now more information coming out about who knew what in advance and how much, it could make Netanyahu's political survival beyond this active phase of the war almost impossible.
I hate to end it on a kind of bit of a dour and down note, but it's a very difficult situation. We will stay with it, and I want to thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing you in the new year.